Welcome to station number 3. Station number 3 is going to be all about erosion. So the first thing we need to do is define erosion. Now, to do that, we're simply going to state that erosion is any process that is destroying something very slowly. Now, to get further into depth with that, let's look at the 4 different types of erosion. Don't mind the rabbit. That is my roommate's love and adorable little pet that roams around. Anyway, back to the erosion. The first type is water. Then we have ice, wind, and finally land. Now the water type of erosion we're actually not going to talk about in this video because that's going to be at a different station. But we can start talking about the ice. Now there are 2 ways that ice can erode things. The first way are glaciers, which move massive amounts of land, carving their way down. They're called solid rivers because they flow downhill with gravity, pushing and dragging along different debris as they go. The second way that ice can erode a rock is through expansion. Now expansion works because the water molecules, the ones that look like Mickey Mouses, while in liquid form, they can slosh around and move side to side and they freely move about. But in solid form, they create bonds in between each other that push each other away, making the 6-sided crystalline structure inside the ice. This makes it so the same number of molecules in solid form takes up a lot more space than the same number of molecules in liquid form. Now the reason this is important is because if we go down here, we can see that when we start out with a rock and it has a little crack and water gets in there and then freezes and expands, it'll push the rock apart a little bit and then have to do this over and over and over again, and eventually the rock will split in half. Now it doesn't stop there. The rock has not just one crack, it has a whole bunch of little cracks. And so eventually, with enough freezing and thawing and expanding, we get a whole bunch of little pebbles. Now it is worth mentioning that this process is not a normal process. Normal liquids, when in a liquid form, will move around freely just like the water molecules, but in solid form they will actually compact and go snug right next to each other. This is why water is so special, because it has the ability to expand when frozen. Most liquids do not do this, they condense. Now the third type is wind. Wind is separated out into 3 different categories, either suspension, saltation, or surface creep. Now suspension is the easy one for people to remember because it's when dust or loess is suspended in the air. It's tiny little particles just floating along in the air, moving from one area to the other. Saltation is when it's bouncing along, and then surface creeping is when it's creeping along and rolling along the bottom. Now the reason these 3 processes are important is because all 3 of these move the objects in the air or along the ground and end up beating up other things through friction. That's what makes them erode. The last version of erosion we need to talk about is land erosion. Now, land erosion can be devastating, but it's simply an imbalance. We call them landslides. They're caused when gravity is stronger than the forces holding the earth in place. So when there's an imbalance between gravity and the things holding the mountain up, that's when we have landslides. So if we have a nice little mountain here, and then we have some people, and then they have, like their house. We don't really want the little mountain to come crashing down and envelop their house. And so you have to think about that type of things. What would cause a landslide? So let's think about the forces pulling the mountain down, trying to destroy our home, and then we'll think about the forces holding the mountain up. Now, pulling down, first most, gravity. Always pulling down. Now, water is another thing that's going to be helpful, but we'll talk about that in a second. I'm going to draw a little doodle, but don't worry about it. We're going to get back to that. The next factor that's pulling the mountain down is going to be how steep that mountain is. So if we have a really steep mountain, it's like putting a ball on top of it. It's going to go flying down the hill. Versus if you put it on a really not steep mountain, it's going to creep along and not really do much. Now, on the side of the argument where what's holding the mountain up, vegetation is going to be our biggest friend here. Vegetation puts down roots. Roots act like little support beams that hold the mountain in place. This is why deforestation is a bad thing. You remove those trees and those bushes that are holding up the mountain, and the mountain has nothing stopping it from coming down. Now, the next thing we're going to talk about is going to be water. Now, I said water earlier because it can be on either side of things. So water can be good and bad. Consider when you're making a sandcastle. The right amount of water and you can create your little pillars, but add too much water and then you just get a soupy, sloshy mess. This same thing happens when you think about landslides. Too much water and the mountain will turn into a slush and come crashing down, destroying our little village. But just a little bit of water, moisture, can help it stay upright. Now, the next thing we need to put on here is earthquakes. Earthquakes end up shaking everything, which can cause things to wiggle out of place and move downhill. The last thing helping us to keep the mountain where it is actually going to be the hard structures. These can be man-made, like barriers that we build to hold the wall, or they can be natural, like giant forms of lava rock.